What if the person entrusted with your health, the one sworn to heal and protect, became the source of unimaginable pain? What if prejudice, unchecked and unhidden, surfaced in a place where trust is supposed to be absolute? This is the story of a young Black girl seeking care, and the doctor whose actions would leave a community shocked and outraged. It began on what seemed like an ordinary day in a well-regarded hospital. The girl, accompanied by her mother, came in for what was supposed to be a routine checkup. But what unfolded behind those clinic doors was far from routine. Words were exchanged, actions taken, and soon the air grew heavy with tension. This wasn't just a bad bedside manner or a moment of miscommunication. This was something deeper, something far more troubling. Today, we recount an incident that reveals the cracks in a system meant to serve all equally. This is a story of a doctor who acted on prejudice, a young girl who bore the brunt of it, and the unexpected turn that forced the doctor to confront the weight of his actions. What followed changed lives, exposed injustices, and sent ripples far beyond the walls of that clinic. As we navigate the events of that fateful day, we'll hear from those who were there, examine the fallout, and ask the pressing questions that demand answers. How did this happen? What does it say about the systems we rely on? And ultimately, how does justice find its way in a world still grappling with inequities? Stay with us as we uncover the truth behind the actions of a doctor who underestimated not just the strength of a family, but also the significance of who that young girl's father turned out to be. She was just 15 years old, full of promise and ambition. Her name was Amara, a quiet yet determined young girl who had dreams of becoming a scientist. In her small but close-knit community, Amara was known as the kind of child who was always curious, always learning. Her mother often joked that she'd taken apart every appliance in the house by the time she was 10 just to see how they worked. But today, Amara wasn't tinkering with gadgets or reading about faraway galaxies. She was sitting in a waiting room, dressed in her Sunday best, clutching her mother's hand as they waited for her appointment. What was meant to be a routine visit to the doctor would soon become anything but. The doctor on call that day was Dr. Richard Hartley, a name well regarded in his field. He had spent decades building a reputation as a skilled physician, someone the community trusted. Patients and colleagues often described him as stern but capable. Yet, behind the medical degrees on his office wall and the accolades he often spoke of, there were whispers. Whispers about a man whose personal biases sometimes colored his interactions. His professionalism was rarely questioned outright, but there were moments, small comments, subtle gestures, that left some feeling uneasy. None of it had ever been enough to prompt an official complaint. Until now, the clinic was a typical suburban healthcare facility, bustling with patients and staff. The walls were lined with pastel art prints, the air faintly scented with antiseptic. Nurses hurried from room to room, their shoes squeaking softly on the linoleum floors. It was a place that represented safety and care for most who entered, but for Amara and her mother, that day, it became a place of humiliation and pain. To understand the weight of what happened next, we must look beyond the clinic's walls, to the world outside. This was a community grappling with unspoken divisions. Though diversity was growing, the shadows of an unequal past lingered. Conversations about race were often avoided, and tensions simmered beneath the surface. For families like Amara's, the clinic was supposed to be a refuge from these realities, a space where competence and care mattered more than color. But that belief would soon be tested. Amara's family had visited this clinic before, but this was their first encounter with Dr. Hartley. From the moment he walked into the exam room, there was something about his demeanor that set Amara's mother on edge. Perhaps it was the way he avoided eye contact, or the clipped tone he used to ask his questions. At first, she tried to brush it off, telling herself it was nothing. After all, doctors were busy people, but as the minutes passed, it became impossible to ignore. His voice carried an edge, a certain impatience that felt unwarranted. And then came the comments, small, cutting remarks about Amara's behavior, her appearance, remarks that carried a weight far beyond their words. Amara, too young to fully grasp the situation, stayed silent, shrinking into herself as her mother tried to respond with measured politeness. But inside, her mother was seething. She knew what this was. She had seen it before, in classrooms, in stores, and now here, in a place that was supposed to be about healing and care. And as the tension in the room grew, so did the sense that this encounter was heading towards something far more serious. The conflict came to a head over something as simple as a question. Amara's mother asked for clarification about the treatment plan, a reasonable request any parent would make. But Draw Hartley's response was sharp, dismissive, and laced with an accusation. If you people took better care of yourselves, we wouldn't be having this conversation. The room fell silent, the words hanging heavy in the air. Amara's mother could feel her daughter's grip tighten around her hand. This was no longer about medical care. This was about respect, about dignity, and about drawing a line. What happened next would set off a chain of events that no one in that room could have predicted. A mother's quiet strength, a young girl's resilience, and a single phone call would bring Dark Hartley's world crashing down. And as the truth about Amara's family emerged, the very foundation of the doctor's arrogance began to crumble. On the surface, it started as any routine checkup would. Dre Hartley glanced at Amara's chart, asked a few questions, and began his examination. But from the first words he spoke, there was an edge to his tone, a lack of warmth that felt out of place for a doctor, especially one examining a teenager. Amara sat quietly, her hands clasped in her lap, answering his questions in short, soft replies. Her mother stood beside her, watching closely. She could feel the shift in the room, a subtle yet undeniable tension growing with each passing moment. The first sign of trouble came when Amara's mother asked a routine question about the medication being prescribed. Why does she need this, doctor? Is there something serious we should be worried about? It was a simple question, the kind any parent would ask, but Dark Hartley's response was curt, dismissive. Without looking up from his clipboard, he muttered, "You people always make things more complicated than they need to be." Amara's mother froze. Did she hear him correctly? The words echoed in her mind, and for a moment she couldn't decide whether to respond or let it go. She chose to address it. "Excuse me, doctor," she said carefully, her voice steady but firm. "What exactly do you mean by that?" Dr. Hartley finally looked up, his expression unreadable. "I mean," he said, "if you'd been paying attention to her health, we wouldn't be in this situation." The air in the room seemed to thicken. Amara's mother felt her heart race, her anger rising. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, Dre Hartley interrupted. "Look, let's not make this difficult," he said, his voice rising. "Just follow the instructions I'm giving you, and maybe you can avoid these problems in the future." He turned his attention back to Amara, who was now visibly uncomfortable, her eyes fixed on the floor. But the tipping point came moments later when the doctor's frustration boiled over. As he prepared to leave the room, he muttered under his breath, but loud enough for both Amara and her mother to hear, "I don't have time to deal with this nonsense today." The words hung in the air like a slap, and Amara's mother felt the weight of them land squarely on her chest. For Amara, it was even worse. She felt a lump form in her throat, her cheeks burning with humiliation. She didn't fully understand the depth of the insult, but she understood enough to feel small, undeserving, and unwelcome. Her mother, however, was not about to let this pass. "Doctor," she said sharply, stepping forward, "you have no right to speak to us that way. We came here for care, not judgment." Dry Hartley turned back, his face flushed with annoyance. "I'm doing my job," he snapped. "If you don't like it, you're free to go elsewhere." The tension in the room reached its peak. Amara's mother took a deep breath, steadying herself. She knew this was not just about her or her daughter. It was about standing up to the kind of behavior she had encountered too many times before. "We'll be reporting this," she said, calmly but firmly. "You'll hear from us again." As they left the clinic, Amara was silent, her head bowed. She felt a confusing mix of emotions: shame, anger, sadness. "Why did he say those things?" she asked her mother, softly. Her mother stopped walking, turned to her daughter, and placed her hands gently on her shoulders. "Because some people still believe they're better than others," she said. "But they're wrong, and we're going to show him that." The immediate aftermath of the incident rippled beyond that exam room. Nurses had overheard the exchange, their faces betraying their unease. Some exchanged glances but said nothing, unwilling or perhaps afraid to intervene. One nurse, however, later approached Amara's mother in the parking lot. "I just want you to know," she said quietly, "you're not wrong to speak up. This isn't the first time something like this has happened here." That single comment only strengthened Amara's mother's resolve. By the time they reached home, Amara's father had already been told everything. He listened carefully, his expression darkening as the story unfolded. And then, without hesitation, he made a call. "This isn't going to end here," he said, his voice steady but resolute. "That doctor doesn't know who he's dealing with." What happened next would ensure that Draw Hartley's actions didn't just remain another unspoken incident in a long line of injustices. The wheels were in motion, and by the time the doctor realized the gravity of what he had done, it would already be too late to undo the damage. It wasn't long after the incident that the full weight of what had transpired began to unfold. As promised, Amara's father took immediate action. His name was Gabriel Adisa, a man whose reputation preceded him in courtrooms and boardrooms across the nation. He was no ordinary man. He was a leading civil rights attorney, known for his relentless pursuit of justice in cases of racial discrimination and systemic inequities. For decades, he had fought for those without a voice, winning landmark cases that reshaped laws and lives. To those who knew him, Gabriel Adisa was a force of nature, and now, that force was directed squarely at Dr. Richard Hartley. The first inkling that Dr. Hartley was in over his head came through a simple letter, delivered to his clinic's administration. It bore the official seal of one of the most prestigious law firms in the country, Gabriel Adisa's law firm. The letter detailed the events of the appointment, outlined the grievances of Amara and her family, and stated the intention to pursue legal action unless a formal apology and significant reparations were made. But it was the signature at the bottom of the letter that caught D. Hartley's eye: Gabriel Adisa. For a moment, the name didn't register, but as he read it again, a wave of recognition swept over him. He had heard of Gabriel Adisa. Everyone in his field had. At first, D. Hartley dismissed the letter, assuming it was an empty threat, a bluff from an angry parent. But when the media began reporting on the story, his confidence began to waver. News outlets picked up the details. A racist comment made by a prominent doctor to a young black girl, followed by a legal threat from one of the most respected civil rights attorneys in the country. The headlines were damning, and they spread like wildfire. Doctor faces backlash over racist remarks to teen, read one. Civil rights lawyer takes on discrimination in medicine, read another. The public response was swift and unrelenting. Dr. Hartley's colleagues began distancing themselves, issuing statements that condemned any form of discrimination and affirming their commitment to inclusivity. Patients canceled appointments, staff at the clinic resigned, and the administration launched an internal investigation to assess the claims. For Dr. Hartley, the walls were closing in. What had begun as a routine day at the clinic had spiraled into a public relations nightmare, and it was about to get worse. A week later, Gabriel Adisa held a press conference. Flanked by Amara and her mother, he spoke with the precision and power that had defined his career. "This is not just about my daughter," he said, his voice steady but resolute. "This is about every child, every person who has ever been made to feel less than because of the color of their skin. My daughter deserves better. We all deserve better." The press conference was broadcast nationally, and it left little room for doubt. This was a fight Gabriel Adisa intended to win. For dear Hartley, the revelation of Gabriel Adisa's identity marked the turning point. He had underestimated the family, dismissing them as unimportant. Now he was facing a battle he could not control. In a desperate attempt to salvage his reputation, he issued a public apology. Standing in front of cameras, his voice trembling, he said, "To Amara and her family, I am deeply sorry. My words and actions were wrong, and I take full responsibility." But the apology, hastily delivered and lacking sincerity, did little to quell the outrage. If anything, it only added fuel to the fire. The consequences came swiftly. The clinic's board suspended Dr. Hartley, pending the outcome of their investigation. Professional organizations released statements condemning his behavior, and several began reviewing his membership status. Lawsuits were filed not just by Amara's family but by others who came forward with similar stories of discriminatory treatment. Each new revelation chipped away at the image Dr. Hartley had carefully cultivated over decades. But perhaps the most significant consequence was the loss of trust. Patients who had once praised him now felt betrayed. Parents questioned whether their children were safe in his care. The community he had served for years no longer saw him as a healer, but as a symbol of a deeper, uglier problem. For Amara and her family, the revelation of Gabriel Adisa's identity was more than a turning point. It was a moment of empowerment. It was a reminder that they were not alone, that their voices mattered, and that justice could prevail. And for Dr. Hartley, it was a harsh lesson in accountability, a reminder that actions have consequences, and that prejudice, once exposed, cannot be easily forgiven or forgotten. As the dust began to settle, one question lingered in the minds of many. How could someone entrusted with the care of others allow their biases to cause harm? It was a question that extended beyond Dr. Hartley, reaching into the very fabric of the medical field and society at large. And it was a question that, thanks to Gabriel Adisa and his family, could no longer be ignored. In the months following the incident, Amara and her family found themselves at the center of a storm they never asked for, but refused to shy away from. For Amara, the experience was deeply personal. At 15, she was forced to grapple with questions many never face in a lifetime. Why had she been treated differently? What had she done to deserve such disrespect? But with her parents by her side, especially her father, she began to transform her pain into purpose. Amara's mother, who had been the first to speak out in that exam room, took on the role of her daughter's fiercest advocate. She ensured Amara had access to therapy to process the emotional toll of the experience. In those sessions, Amara found a safe space to express her feelings, anger, sadness, confusion, and to reclaim her sense of self-worth. Through therapy, she began to understand that the problem was not hers to bear, but a reflection of the biases that still plague society. Meanwhile, Gabriel Adisa went beyond the legal battle to focus on the larger fight. Using the platform that the incident had created, he began a nationwide campaign to address systemic racism in the medical field. He collaborated with healthcare professionals, civil rights organizations, and policymakers to push for reforms. His efforts led to a series of changes, from mandatory anti-racism training for medical staff to the creation of more robust reporting mechanisms for patients who experience discrimination. Gabriel's work didn't just hold Dr. Hartley accountable. It started a ripple effect that challenged institutions to confront the biases within their walls. For Amara, this public fight became a source of healing and empowerment. She began speaking at events, sharing her story with others who had faced similar injustices. Each time she stood before a crowd, she felt her voice grow stronger. What had once been a source of shame and pain became a symbol of resilience and hope. But the impact of this case went far beyond one family. It forced an entire community, and indeed the nation, to confront uncomfortable truths. The revelations about Dre Hartley's actions sparked broader conversations about racism in medicine. Studies and statistics that had long been ignored were now thrust into the spotlight. Data showed that Black patients were less likely to receive adequate pain management, more likely to face dismissive attitudes, and often subjected to implicit biases that compromised their care. These weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a pattern, a systemic issue that demanded attention. The medical community, faced with mounting public pressure, began to respond. Hospitals and clinics across the country aimed to respond to access to patient-failing capacity. Medical schools revised their curriculums to include education on implicit bias and cultural competency. Advocacy groups amplified their voices, demanding accountability and transparency in patient care. While these changes didn't erase the problem overnight, they marked a crucial step toward progress. For Amara's family, the broader implications of their fight were clear. This wasn't just about their daughter, it was about every patient who had ever felt invisible or devalued in a place meant to offer healing. It was about creating a world where no one else would have to endure what they had experienced. And it was about holding those in power accountable, ensuring that the trust placed in doctors and institutions was never taken for granted again. As the dust began to settle, there were lessons to be learned, not just for Dre Hartley, but for society as a whole. His actions served as a stark reminder that prejudice, when left unchecked, can infiltrate even the most trusted institutions. But it also showed the power of speaking out, of refusing to accept injustice as inevitable. Amara's family taught us that change begins with courage, that progress requires persistence, and that even in the face of pain, there is strength to be found. For Dear Hartley, the consequences were life-changing. He lost his position at the clinic, his medical license was suspended, and his reputation was irreparably damaged. But perhaps the most profound consequence was the loss of trust, not just from his patients, but from the community he once served. It was a fall from grace that he would never recover from, a reminder that actions have consequences and that no one is above accountability. As for Amara, she is no longer the quiet, unassuming girl who walked into that clinic on an ordinary day. She is now a young woman with a voice that carries weight, a symbol of resilience and hope. Her story reminds us that progress is possible, but it requires vigilance, action, and a commitment to justice. In the end, this story is not just about a racist doctor or a brave family. It's about all of us. It's about the kind of world we want to build, the kind of systems we want to uphold, and the kind of future we want to create. Because in the fight for equality, every voice matters, every action counts, and every story, like Amara's, has the power to inspire change. As the story of Amara and her family comes to a close, it leaves us with more than just the details of an incident. It leaves us with an enduring reminder of the work that still needs to be done. This is not simply about one doctor's actions or one family's courage. It is a mirror held up to society, reflecting the biases that persist in spaces meant to be safe and the resilience required to confront them. Amara's journey highlights the profound consequences of prejudice, but it also showcases the power of standing up, speaking out, and demanding change. Her family's unwavering determination forced accountability, not just for one individual, but for a system that allowed such behavior to go unchecked. Through their actions, they transformed pain into progress, proving that even in moments of darkness, there is an opportunity to create light. But their story is not an anomaly. It is part of a broader narrative that stretches across communities, professions, and institutions. The medical field, like so many others, is not immune to the biases that shape our world. Studies continue to show disparities in how patients of different races are treated. Disparities that cost lives, erode trust, and perpetuate inequities. America's case reminds us that every patient deserves dignity, respect, and care free from prejudice. So, what do we do with this knowledge? How do we, as individuals and as a society, ensure that stories like Amara's become less common, that trust in our institutions is not a privilege but a right for all? It begins with self-reflection. Each of us must confront the biases we carry, whether explicit or implicit, and ask how they influence our actions. It continues with vigilance, calling out injustice when we see it and refusing to be complicit in its perpetration. This is not a fight for a single family or a single community. It is a fight for all of us, for the systems we rely on to function justly, for the professions we trust to act ethically, and for the future we hope to build. It requires courage, the courage to question, to challenge, and to change. And it requires compassion, the ability to see others not through the lens of stereotypes, but through the shared humanity that connects us all. To those watching, ask yourself, what would you have done if you were in Amara's place? In her mother's? In her father's? And perhaps more importantly, what will you do the next time you witness injustice? Will you speak up, take action, and join the fight for equality? Or will you let it pass, hoping someone else will take a stand? It's not enough to condemn racism in principle. We must challenge it in practice, in our workplaces, our schools, our communities, and yes, even in ourselves. Because real change doesn't happen in silence or inaction. It happens when ordinary people, like Amara and her family, refuse to accept the status quo and demand better. As we end this story, remember, this is not just a tale of injustice and accountability. It is a call to action, a reminder that the power to create a more just and equitable world lies in the choices we make every day. So the question we leave you with is simple. When faced with prejudice, what will you do? The answer to that question will shape not just the world we live in today, but the legacy we leave for generations to come. Let's ensure it's a legacy of justice, equality, and unwavering courage.